Hey there, welcome back to the Complicated Kids podcast. I'm your host, Gabriele Nicolet. I am a speech therapist, a toddler whisperer, and a parent coach. And today I have Julianne Reilly with me. Julianne, welcome.
Thank you.
We're going to be talking about all the work that parents get to do on themselves today. But before we jump in, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Sure. Well, I am a clinical social worker. I work in school. I've worked in schools pretty much my whole career. I previously, prior to becoming a social worker, I was a teacher, a music teacher, actually. So I have worked with kids and families for the last 15 years. I love the work that I do in schools, and then I also do some private practice work, mostly primarily working with parents and caregivers. I run groups and classes and do individual work, and I do a lot of training for teachers on in positive discipline, which is hopefully what we'll talk a bunch about today. And also, I have a wonderful opportunity to practice very imperfectly with my own kids, which is really a lot of the growth that I have made and has really taught me a lot and brought a lot to how I support other parents and caregivers.
My guess is, well, you tell me if this is true for you. When I became a parent, my therapeutic abilities expanded a lot because all of a
Yeah.
sudden I understood why a parent would only feed their child white food
Yes.
or why a parent would shove a phone at a screaming 2-year-old. Like I got it. I
Yeah.
understood.
Yes.
Is that true for you too?
Absolutely. I think so much of the work that my own parenting has helped me come to is that idea of like, there's no judgments being made of any other choice. Everyone is making their choice for a reason. They're doing the best they can with, the skills and whatever's going on in their environment that they have. And so it's really just about, helping parents achieve the goals that they want, right, for their family, and figuring out how to navigate all of those, all the challenges that get thrown in our way in order
Yeah.
to try to do that, right?
There's a quote I really love, and I want people, the listeners, to like hold it while we have this conversation because we are going to be talking about like the idea that raising children requires us to do a lot of work. In other words, introspection, asking questions, changing things about the way we do business internally without even addressing any needs of a child. So that's like just preview. But there's this quote that I heard Liz Gilbert say, and I don't know if it's hers or not, but she says, I love you just the way you are, and far too much to let you stay that way.
Mhm. Yeah, I love
Right?
that.
So it's like this idea that like we're all doing the best we can, and tomorrow we can do a little bit better.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so, okay. So with that said, let's talk about positive discipline and like what it is, first of all,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
I hear like, oh, it means I have to be positive all the time.
Right. Yes. Well, and I think there's so much out there about positive parenting and gentle parenting, and I mean, there's just so much out there. Positive discipline is its own kind of unique. While it aligns really well with a lot of that philosophy, that we talk about positive discipline in the positive discipline world being like positive discipline with a big P, uppercase P, and uppercase D. It is a philosophy that was developed by Jane Nelson, and but is based in Adlerian psychology. And for those listeners who may not be, familiar with that, Alfred Adler was a contemporary of Freud, but had a very different philosophy about human behavior and was kind of ahead of his time in just his theories about, social justice and equality. And he really believed that human behavior was driven by this need for belonging and significance. And so, like, we're all striving towards this goal of wanting to feel like we belong and like we matter. And so when we don't feel that, right, when we're feeling that's discouragement, right? When we're not able to achieve that feeling of belonging, significance, and we might try to achieve that in unuseful ways. And so that applies to all of us, right? Adults, children, everyone. But when we are looking at our children's behavior, really it's about digging in around like, okay, so if there's challenging behaviors that are showing up and reframing that as maybe there's discouragement there, and maybe these are unuseful ways of trying to achieve that belonging and significance. When I work with teachers, I think a really easy way that kind of everyone has experienced is like the kid who, you know, is labeled as kind of the class clown, right? Like they get a lot of laughter from behaviors or jokes or things that happen in class. And sometimes, I mean, we don't know, right? For every kid, it's going to be different, but a possible hypothesis for that behavior might be that that's how they belong, right? Maybe they're struggling academically and there's something else going on. And so they know like they're not going to belong in that way in the classroom, or they're struggling like to connect socially in other ways, but they figured out, you know what, I can make everyone laugh. And that's how I get that sense of belonging and significance. And so it's just interesting to like start to peel back the layers and actually look at like what might be going on rather than just that tip of the iceberg, that metaphor of the iceberg of looking just at that. And so that's sort of the framework of it. There's a lot more we can talk about, but that's the underpinning philosophy behind it all.
I think of the example that always comes up about unuseful kinds of behaviors is when you're on the phone. When one is on the phone and one's child, really of any age, is like, mommy, 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 right?
Yeah. Yes.
Until and unless they get your attention. And that is like, I think a classic example of what you're talking about here, right? Which is like, do I matter? Are you paying attention to me? Sometimes to the point of like, do I even exist if you're not paying attention to me? Like, I do feel like there can be this like kind of existential dread of, if I'm not being seen, do I even exist?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's like a classic example of like, that's so annoying for us. And yet it comes from this place of like needing to know.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And we talk a lot about like that, like they just are attention seeking, right? But really we reframe that as like they're always trying to seek connection in some way, right? It's all about connection. And when we dig into like that's the underpinning philosophy behind positive discipline. But when we look at the model, we really talk about, is it respectful and encouraging, right? And one of the main pieces that we talk about is kindness and firmness at the same time. And so like, what does that actually look like? Which is quite challenging for most of us as adults, even in our adult relationships.
And I think as soon as we get to kindness, somebody's going to say, yeah, but my child is not kind to me.
Yes.
So
yes.
Go there a little bit.
I love, so we talk about mutual respect in positive discipline. And most of the time when we start talking about this in classes or trainings that I provide, we talk about like, what does that mean to you? And often what comes up for most of us when we hear that is like, well, I'll respect you if you respect me. Right. So like, and really when it comes down to it in positive discipline, we're actually not talking about that. We tease that out by saying, you know, I am going to show you respect, but I'm also going to respect myself. So the kindness doesn't necessarily have to be, you know, what comes to mind for most of us is that like gentle, sugary, sweet kindness. You know, that's not necessarily what it means. It might mean that for some people, but it's really that I'm showing you, I'm seeing you, I'm connecting with you, I'm showing you respect. But the mutual respect part is not I'm going to demand respect from you. It's I'm going to respect myself and set boundaries in that situation, right? Which is so hard to wrap our heads around, especially I think in the society we live in and trying to navigate, you know, what do boundaries look like? Because so often setting boundaries is seen as we feel like it is mean, or it's like, you know, we're making someone else feel uncomfortable. And so finding the way to do that, you know, to find that kindness and firmness at the same time, which really is just I'm going to respect you and I'm also going to respect myself, is really challenging. And it's like, what does that look like or sound like?
And it goes back to, this is going to get a little meta for a second, because, and I'm going to take a 2-year-old example because it's so obvious, right? A 2-year-old says, no, no, I will not, whatever, eat the peas, have a diaper change, leave the house, put on my shoes, pick your thing, doesn't matter. And we think that that is bad. Why do we think that that's bad? Well, partially because nobody told us that that was okay when we were 2.
Yes.
You go into this I do anyway, this very big space of like how, and as a practitioner, it's a little bit like, How am I going to teach you, parent, that you are allowed to say no when you have a whole upbringing of not being allowed to do that? Because your child now demands it of you that you allow them to say no.
Yeah.
And it gets wonky real fast.
Yeah.
I sometimes say there are actually three of you in that interaction, right? There's adult you and there's your child,
Yes.
but then there's child you.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It's so complex, right? We're bringing all of our own stuff, and then we're also like, there's so much fear of what other people are thinking, right? Like when I'm out in public and I'm navigating a situation, I have to remind myself, which I don't always do perfectly, but like I want people to judge me based on like how I am how I'm showing up in those challenging moments, not on my child's behavior, right? Like that is not, we are, every child, and I've listened to some of your other episodes, which I love hearing about, like we all, you can be doing all of the quote unquote right things. There is no, I don't think there is such a thing, but so, so you could be doing all those things, whatever they are, and your child is going to be their own unique self, right? They're all going to have their own stuff that they're trying to figure out and navigate. And so I've always been like, I want to be judged on how I show up in a situation, right? Not, and even maybe not even judge, because I don't judge any parent when I'm seeing them have a meltdown because their child is, because we've all been there before. But if I'm judging myself, I guess I want to think about, am I living by my values in this challenging moment? My kid may or may not respond in the way I want them to. But in your situation with the shoes and the peas and whatnot, I think it's sort of letting go of the idea that we can control another human being. And that is so hard to do. It's so hard to do.
And partially, again, because it was done to us. Like we
Yeah.
actually did think that we had to comply. And once you start putting choice on that, and again, children, a little bit of a different situation. Certainly when we are adults, we choose. I mean, I told a parent last week, I was like, you don't have to take care of your children. And she looked at me, she was like, but then someone would call Child Protective Services. And I said, yes. So can we acknowledge that of the choices between taking care of your children and somebody calling Child Protective Services, you're choosing to take care of your children? Can we start there?
Right.
And now maybe do we have a little bit less resentment because you actually are making a choice here? I mean, again, it gets pretty like, can blow your mind a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So so what are like, we've kind of outlined positive discipline as it relates to, okay, I respect myself. We have kindness and firmness. I respect you also. It's not contingent. Respect is both an innate right of me and an innate right for you.
Yes.
How does that play? Like, give us some specifics where people either struggle or, see that happen.
I mean, I think that there's a lot of let's start with like meltdowns, right? Tantrums, meltdowns, any what from the littlest ones to the big ones, right? I think there's a lot of and it ties to some of what we're talking about with our own, our own discomfort, our own stuff that comes up. When we talk about, when we think about the kind and firm, the classic is like, I love you, and the answer is no. Right. And then what happens after that, right? So there's, I love you, I see you, you really want that ice cream, maybe that's the thing, right? And the answer is no. Maybe like we'll get ice cream next weekend or whatever that looks like. And that's the kindness and firmness, right? I'm setting the boundary. And then what follows is maybe a lot of feelings about that, right? Depending on, your child and the age and the situation. And I think a lot of the time, there is this feeling that we need to do something about that, right? Like that we should have a tool. We can be kind and firm, and that's just going to deal with it, right? That's like the quick fix, and it's not, right? It's not necessarily, right? We're teaching skills, we're setting boundaries, we're all of those things, but then we're also going to have feelings, connected to that. And so there's also the piece about like teaching. Another big part of positivism is teaching skills too, right? And so then it's like, how do we help our kids then learn to navigate frustration, disappointment, all these things without just fixing it, right? Because it could be easy. They have a meltdown, they're like, okay, no, never mind, we'll have the ice cream, right? But then, maybe that takes care of that momentary issue, right? We don't have to deal with the crying, the screaming, the kicking on the floor, but it's not actually teaching our kids to become capable of managing all of these things. And the more and more work that I've done over the years is like the skill that I think so many of not just kids, adults too, are missing is being able to tolerate unpleasant emotions, and sit with them. I mean, a lot of the parents I work with, more of the work is how do you tolerate the unpleasantness of watching your kid struggle? And so I think part of it is these tools we use, but then it's also, okay, what happens after? And how do you navigate that part after?
Totally.
And that's hard. Yeah.
Well, and I mean, I say this all the time too, which is when I first started doing parent coaching and really sitting with negative emotions myself, because when you get a coaching certification, probably, I don't know how it works in social work school, but your first client is yourself. And you start sitting with that, brain is screaming at you that you're going to die if you feel this feeling. And it takes practice and it takes repetition and it takes tolerance of discomfort that builds over time. The capacity builds over time to recognize, oh, actually, I'm not going to die if I feel this thing. But then again, go back to, right, whatever, someone who's in their 30s, 40s, 50s even, who has a lifetime of not practicing that. And now they have a child who demands that they practice that, because their child is having big emotions. And then you've got a real pickle.
Yeah.
You've got a stew and some juices there.
Absolutely. Well, there's two things that come to mind when I hear you say that. One's I'll share what we do in positive discipline, but then I'll share a personal story. One of the first things that I will do with either a group of parents or a group of teachers or an individual in an individual session is think about like, when you picture your child when they're grown, whatever that looks like, what are some of the qualities and characteristics that do you envision, do you hope that you've helped instill in them? Like, what kind of person are you hoping that they become? And I mean, that list is kind of universal. I mean, when I'm doing this, it's pretty much the same every time with a few like little differences here and there. Empathetic, responsible, independent, critical thinking, I'm just thinking of all, like being kind, self-awareness, like being able to regulate your emotions, right? Like all of these things. And so we talk about like that list of qualities and characteristics. We also make a list usually prior to that of all the challenges that like the daily challenges that are popping up. And then we talk about like, how do we get from like these challenges that we face every day to building these skills, right? Like we want to get from here to here. And sometimes then I have parents make a third list. Like, what do your children need from you to get from like point A to point B? And often it's a very similar list, right? Like they need us to be able to model all the things that we want for them. And that's hard work. And it's very humbling to realize like, oh, I have the same work to do and I still have to figure that out. And I have one child who's neurodiverse, and it has been quite a path for my husband and I to like recognize, and it's very humbling to like, I do all of this work for parents, right? I have done this, for years. I worked with, and when I was faced with all of those challenges in my own home, I was like, how can I help I don't know what I'm doing. How can I help other parents when I am messing this up in every possible way? And a really wonderful practitioner who was supporting us was like, you just have to ground yourself first, right? And figure out like focus on yourself, like believe that you can handle these hard things. And I realized that like I felt so out of control. I was so, not able to sit with the unpleasantness and those things. And I was trying so hard to like fix and change and, my child rather than like focusing in on myself. Yeah. And as soon as I was able to like do that and be like, okay, what do I need to do to ground myself? What are the skills that I need? That is actually when we made the most progress. Yeah. And I think that's so often the case, when we're so outwardly focused, if we can stop and take that step back, and can be so helpful.
And that's not to say that kids don't need support too. Like for sure, kids need help. Some kids need more help than others. Kids need specific kinds of help. Yes, we should get them all of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we should also, I think, you would agree probably, right? I call that doing your own work, right? Yeah. Recognizing how is what I'm bringing to the equation, how is what my nervous system is broadcasting, how is what my words, my face, my body language, what that's transmitting, either helping or not helping this larger situation here. And if something's not working, am I willing to change the way that I'm doing something, since that's the only control I have? That is such a bummer. Like the day, my colleague Jen and I, we run this Raising Orchid Kids class, right? It's an 8-week class that when we talk a lot about behavior. And when we get to, I can't remember, it's like the second or third week of, hey, guess what? The only person's behavior that you can actually control is your own. I feel like it's such a downer. It's like, sorry.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, because so many parents come to things hoping like you're going to give them that quick fix of like, how can I change this? And what's so cool about it is like when you start to change your own behavior, it does change things, right? It does. And probably even more effectively than if you keep trying, to force something on someone else.
Yeah, massively. Yeah. I mean, that's really
well, and one of the, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say one of the things that came up when you were talking about that is one of the big parts of positive discipline is family meetings. And in the school setting, it's class meetings. And what that looks like is really bringing like the people, whatever the community is, right? But if we're talking about the family together on a regular basis, we try to do it. We have periods of time where we drop off and then we're like, we got to get this going again. But coming together on a regular basis to actually teach kids how to use their voice, right? Like how to have a say in what's happening. And it's not like they get full control. We're still the leaders in the family, right? But having an ability to practice that, on that list of qualities and characteristics that the parents and teachers and whatever we make together when we're doing these sessions and classes, there's often like self-esteem, right? And being able to like, advocate for self-esteem. And so often we don't really give kids an opportunity to practice that, like figure out like, how do you do that in a way that allows people to hear you? And so we teach about these family meetings that are really an opportunity for the family to come together. And what it looks like is we share appreciations. So we actually explicitly teach kids how to share appreciations. And I have, my son who's now 5, but he was doing this when he was I have a sweet video of him as a baby. He couldn't talk. My daughter, who's like 3 or 4, and she's like talking for him, like, I appreciate mommy for, but that was building the blocks for like at 3 years old, he was able to offer a very authentic appreciation that, just from that practice of doing that. And then we problem solve. So then we have like an agenda where any one of us can put something on the agenda, the child, the parent, of an issue that has been coming up in the family. And we talk about ideas for solutions to it. And so we all have kind of a voice in what that might be like. So rather than the parent saying, this is a problem and this is what's going to happen, we might bring up like, this is an issue and we want to figure out how we can together as a family system, like what are some ways do you think we should try out to solve these problems? One example I don't know when, it was a long time ago. My daughter might have been like 4 and she's now 9. We were having an issue with TV time and turning off the TV, and every time there being a meltdown at the end of TV time. And so we actually brought that to the family meeting, and what came out of it was like, we're going to take a week break from TV entirely. And that could have been a punishment, right? I could have said, we're done. We're not going to watch TV for a week. But instead, it was actually her idea as part of the solutions, right? And she had buy-in, and then we did it, and then we were able to kind of reset. And so that comes to another of like positive disciplines model is it's non-punitive and non-permissive. So the idea is like we are setting boundaries, and we want to strive towards finding solutions rather than using punishment to solve those problems. So it doesn't mean there aren't consequences. It doesn't mean there aren't boundaries, but it's more about looking like for solutions to whatever is going on rather than just kind of trying to like deal with a behavior in some quick fix way in a moment.
There's something that's hitting me back to this respect piece, because I think that the yeah, but that comes up for people is, yeah, but they're going to give me bad ideas. Like they're going to say, I should be able to watch TV 24 hours a day. And they might. And if we're not, when adults are not holding the reins so tightly, in my experience anyway, the kids actually, they rise to that occasion because they want to belong. So when they're being edged out of that system, that's when they're like, I need to have all the things. When they're being invited in as a participant, I mean, you tell me, but
Yeah.
and then we probably have to do a little bit of work of like, well, that's clearly not going to work, but I'm going to honor it as a suggestion, right?
Yes. Yes.
So, in your experience, does that go off the rails or does it tend to stay pretty reasonable?
I would say generally pretty reasonable, but we do have some ways of managing that. So one, I think you made a wonderful point of like this. If we go back to what I shared at the beginning, it's all about belonging significance, right? So the more we feel like we matter and our voice matters and we belong in this community and we can share our opinions and our voice, the more we're more likely to like show up in these useful ways, right? When we feel like we're being edged out or we don't belong, we don't matter, we're more likely to become discouraged and show up in kind of more of these unuseful ways. And so I think that is true. And kids are kids, right? And they're going to share some like kind of out there ideas that we know are probably not going to work or might stress us out, right? When we hear. But so we also actually talk about solutions have to be related, reasonable, respectful, and helpful. And so that actually is a really great framework for kind of without saying your idea is bad or wrong or it's not going to work. We can kind of edge out some of these ideas. So that's way like when, your kid's being silly and says, well, let's watch TV for 20 hours a day or whatever that is, then we can go back and go, well, is that reasonable? Like, let's talk about whether that's reasonable or not. Or is that respectful to me, whatever that looks like, or is that going to be helpful? And then they're usually able to say, like, let's cross those off. And so that gives it a little bit of framework because I know that can be really overwhelming. I have a great example of my colleague who uses this in her classroom and does class meetings regularly. And she had a situation where the students were trying to solve a problem. They wanted to be able to use or I think there was some dismissal time. They wanted more activities that they could do. And so they decided they were going to have fidgets at every table. And she knew, like in her mind, the solution they had all agreed upon was this thing. And she knew that it was going to be kind of a disaster in her mind. And she was like, you know what? I'm just going to let it play out. And we're going to have another meeting in 3 days to review it and see how it goes. And of course it was, and before they even got to those 3 days, a couple of students were saying, we need a meeting to rethink this because it is not working. But the fact that they actually got to experience it, right? Rather than us just kind of shutting it down, they got to experience, see it wasn't working and come back to the drawing board to figure out like, what else do we need to do, right? Those are the skills we want them to learn, right? And it is messy. And I think it is hard for us sometimes to let go. Part of it is like letting go of the control a little bit in order to allow the process to happen.
But it's so much less messy than ratting kids out who steal the fidgets for the time because they wanted them, or kids tattling on other kids when they see that happening, or having to revisit it every day, all the time.
Yeah.
And it actually takes less time,
Yeah.
right? Over the course of a relationship.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I think what's interesting to me about that is, when we can let it play out, know that we have the guardrails and trust ourselves enough to manage the process. But I think that there are many of us who we haven't been taught how to trust ourselves to manage a process. And so, if that's you, then that's some good work to do, right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Because I think the thing that happens, right, is our kids are not going to give us significance and value and confidence. That can never come from them. And if we are trying to get it from them, we are in for a world of hurt and disappointment.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I love what you're saying. I mean, the whole thing just plays very, very well in my head, right? Firmness and kindness, respect and self-respect. Boundaries. What did you say? Boundaries and something else. Anyway.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think and then we talk about like inviting kids to discover how capable they are, right? And like that we don't always need to step in to fix things. We can allow them to struggle some. I remember hearing someone at a positive discipline conference one talking about watching her son at 3 years old trying to get his shirt on. And he was crying a little bit. He was frustrated, and she was sitting there, and she could have stepped in and just put all his shirt on for him. But she allowed some struggle to happen. And she was, she was there, she was encouraging. And then he was so proud of himself when he got it on, right? And maybe, I don't remember, maybe it was backwards or inside out or something, right? But it's sort of that idea of like, if we don't allow them to practice these skills from those, things of like getting your t-shirt on, but using your voice. I mean, when we think we fast forward, we want our kids to speak up in situations where maybe there's peer pressure happening or other things happening. But we also want them to just do what we say when we tell them to do it, right? And so then we have to figure out, how are we allowing them to practice these skills within our system so that they have those skills that we want them to have when we go out. But it can be quite challenging. And I say all this knowing that it's hard for me every day as a parent too. So, and I don't do it perfectly. So that's the other thing I try to make sure as we're talking about these things for parents who are like, I don't even know where to start, and just pick one small place to start, right? Like just one small place. You do not have to do it all, at once, because it's messy work. Yeah.
Yeah, it's messy work.
Yeah.
We're not going to dwell here too long. For people, not just kids, but people whose nervous systems are fried. And what I mean by that is they have been in a state of chronic stress for such a long time that they cannot participate in a constructive way in a family meeting, in a family dynamic. These techniques, the positive discipline, as you're describing it in its like pure form, if that even exists, is not going to be great at that moment in time.
Yes.
It's great before that nervous system burnout happens, and it's great after the nervous system burnout happens. But if you've got a kid or a parent for that matter who is in nervous system burnout, we're in survival mode. We are doing whatever we can to make it through the day and keep folks safe.
Yes.
And so if you have somebody in your house, you're listening and you have somebody in your house who's in nervous system burnout, and probably we'll do a podcast about that soon. But you can go back and listen to the interview with Casey Ehrlich from Peaceful Parents, and the interview with Amanda Diekman of Low Demand Parenting, for like a PDA kind of low nervous system profile for those kinds of kids. I just wanted to flag that here because
I'm so glad you did.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the thing that I think is really important is like, this is just a framework, right? It's just a philosophy. And I have one of those kids. I have a kid in my house. I parent very differently with the two children that I have, right? And I wouldn't say, the philosophy is the same, right? I'm approaching them both with that kindness and firmness. But I can put more demands on one child than I will work with another. I do have to think more carefully about how I'm going to approach something with one of my children. I have to think about how I take care of myself, before certain interactions with one of my children. And so I think being aware of like taking care of yourself, which we hear all the time, right? And sometimes it's like, how do I even do that? Like, how do I even start to do that? And drawing on support. I mean, listening to, podcasts like this where you're not alone because so many people are accessing this, but also finding other people who are experiencing this and parenting, complicated kids is just so important, because I know that it's not the same when I'm talking to a parent maybe who is only parenting a neurotypical child, and it's challenging, right? Because the same things are not going to work. Suggestions that they make are not going to always be helpful, and then I'm going to feel like there's something wrong with me or I'm not doing something right. And so really finding a community and finding supporters in those moments is just so important.
Yeah, great. Julianne Reilly, if people want to learn more about you, where do they go?
Yes. Well, I have a website, juliannereilly.com. And so that's where I would do, work with parents, individual work with parents. I do work for a private practice, Weaver and Associates. It's a wonderful practice that sees a lot of children and adolescents in the area. But I do some parent work through them. And so you can find me in those two places. And you can find a lot more about positive discipline at positivediscipline.org or positivediscipline.com. There's a lot of wonderful people doing this work all over the world. So
Thank you so much for being here. Those links will be in the show notes. And I really appreciate you doing this. Thank you.